Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to the Accelerator with Michael Conniff. I'm your host, and we are here as a podcast on that takes advantage of the, let's call it the trials and tribulations of entrepreneurs, founders, startups, and also the VCs, angels, investment firms, and family officers that work with them. And we like to say serve them, but certainly know a lot about them. Remember that you can find us on all the major podcast platforms, Apple, Audible, Amazon. Make sure to subscribe. Give us a nice rating if you think we deserve it. You can also find me, michaelconniff.com, MichaelConniff.com, at Michael Conniff on Twitter. And with that, I want to welcome to the podcast the very distinguished Dr. Nigel Clarke. Welcome, Dr. Clarke. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Michael. Good to be here.
A very difficult man to describe because you do so many things. But Dr. Clarke has been in policy discussions and government panels and boards and bodies in the healthcare area for 40 years. He and I have been connected via UNIPLAT, the unified platform that is trying to bring together entrepreneurs, inventors, innovators from less developed countries onto a place where the playing field is level. Dr. Clarke has also, in the last 20 years, been very heavily involved in a plethora of startups in the healthcare area. So, Dr. Clarke, very happy to have you here. I wanted to start by talking about what you have been doing in the healthcare startup world and what changes you've seen in the last 20 years as you've been active. What we're called the Accelerator, so we're focused on startups, and we will talk about UNIPLAT's role in that. But tell me first, what is your view of the healthcare area? It seems to me as a newcomer that it's incredibly robust and active. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think it is. I suppose the biggest change in the last 20 years is technology for communication, of course. 20 years ago, we were doing email, and we probably were all vaguely getting used to Googling, but we had not got social media. We did not have any of those kinds of ways of instant communication globally. And we didn't really have what I would describe as ways of putting together global data in quite the way we do now. So things have moved very fast indeed in respect of that. I guess we could probably say that we know a little bit more about each other around the world than we knew 20 years ago. In the past, if you wanted to find out about what was going on in another country, you definitely had to go there. And you were never really all that sure whether you were meeting the right people, whether you had missed meeting the person you really needed to be talking to. And governments were very closed affairs. The British government is it used to be classically secretive. It was a lot less open than many others. But on the other hand, there are plenty of others where it was very difficult to extract any information as to what went on. I also think that people didn't meet each other in the same kind of way. Certainly in the healthcare world, healthcare professionals and academics met largely either by virtue of what was published, and we'll come back to that, or by virtue of going to congresses of one sort or another. But you didn't get a lot of advance information about who was going to be there, and you couldn't easily connect with people you met with when you'd been there. So actually, the biggest change is simply connectivity. We are better able to meet each other and talk to each other than we were 20 years ago. And that's a huge difference.
Do you feel like when you were starting on the venture side 20 years ago that in many respects you were flying blind?
Yes. It was more difficult to do due diligence. It was a slightly more closed world. So if you got some new technology coming up, there were only a limited number of people that you would necessarily go and talk to try and validate it in your mind before you got going. So in other words, simple due diligence was more partial. you were less able to. I look at it this way: if you want to describe, it's a bit like a child's mobile. If you describe it from one angle, you describe it one way. But if you walk around it, you're seeing something else and you describe it differently. You need a full 360-degree explanation to understand the full object you're looking at. And the more you can do that, the better you understand what it is you're actually looking at with science, technology as a whole. You need different perspectives to get a grip on it. And it was harder to do in those days. It's easier now.
And so now that we do have the communication, we do have social media, we do have more transparency, and at least in some cases, how has that changed the opportunities you're seeing in the companies that you're investing in or advising others to invest in?
Well, I think we're seeing more, for starters. But I'm not sure, and this is why I think UNIPLAT is so important. I don't think we see much beyond where we would have done 20 years ago. It's the same kinds of markets. We're now beginning to get access to scientists in other countries that we might not have seen 20 years ago. And I think that's a really important development, because there are some great brains out there. There's some really good thinking going on in a lot of different places. I mean, you could say that there are some very obvious differences, like China, for example. And the development of China in the last 20 years has been really fast. A lot of very interesting work coming out from there. But there are plenty of other places where the same applies. So I think that's been a big change and a big advantage, I think. The other thing is that there are, and I'll come back onto this no doubt, there are plenty more business people that you meet now from those countries who have been very successful that you might not have met previously. I mean, to be fair, I mean, I live in London, and the City of London is a place that attracts money from all over the world, and it always has done. So you are always going to meet people who were interested in this kind of thing and who had money and who've been very successful. But actually, the fulcrum for that is changing. Now, if you want to really talk to a wide range of people prepared to back businesses, you need to go to Singapore. Go to Singapore, you discover you should probably be talking to people in Kuala Lumpur as well. You need to be talking in China. It's not just Hong Kong now, and so on and so on and so forth. And I think increasingly we're going to find that becomes entirely global, and rightly so.
And now we have platforms like this and platforms like Zoom that make that even more readily available. I want to point out that Dr. Clarke has been chair of the General Pharmaceutical Council in the UK, and he's been on many committees. He's a senior partner at Learned Lion Partners, chairs the boards of Medical Research Business, Oxford Bioelectronics Diagnostic Business, Marker Limited, and serves on the advocacy committee of the European Society of Cardiology. When I saw that, Dr. Clarke, I was like, oh, on top of everything else, it sounds like you're a cardiologist.
No, I mean, to be fair, I think I may have just stood down from that. But I've been involved with the European Society of Cardiology for more than 10 years. But I started as the chair of their audit committee as a non-cardiologist, and they very kindly asked me to serve on the board for 4 years on their management group. It's a wonderful organisation, but it taught me a great deal about the global reach of healthcare, because although they call themselves the European Society of Cardiology, they actually have 57 member nations, and I think there are rather fewer than 57 European countries, so they reach out beyond that. Their annual congress has 33,000 cardiologists who come from all over the world, and it's an opportunity to really see how academics and healthcare professionals in practice get together to talk about discovery, to talk about the future, to talk about how to make sure that the knowledge they have and the things they have learnt expand beyond where they are already. So there are some wonderful initiatives they've started in other parts of the world, looking at improving cardiac care, which are an illustration of the importance of professionals talking to each other. More than anything else, they are incredibly good at sharing knowledge. And I learned a great deal from that as to how that works and the importance of older, more experienced professionals being prepared to share what they know with younger people and with other colleagues and to bring them into programs, research programs, and so forth. Critical. In fact, I was thinking about this. As you know, one of the big changes in the last 20 years is the whole area of genomics. And if you look at, for example, pharmacogenomics, where it's fairly obvious that people's genes do have an impact on how effective particular medicines are for that individual, the importance of that globally, where you have a whole lot of different gene pools of one sort or another, and clearly different kinds of people react differently to different treatments. That's the kind of knowledge that needs to be shared globally in order to make a difference to global health. And that's why you need these platforms to bring people together so that these things can actually people be talking, basically.
So if UNIPLAT is able to accomplish what it hopes and what it sets out to do, what do you think would be the impact of that? It sounds like there are a lot of places where it's not that scientific inquiry has gone dark, but in fact the opposite. But it seems like if you're a brilliant scientist born in the wrong country, you may have a very difficult time of it. Is that a fair statement?
I think so. For two reasons. First, because you may not have access to the funding to go with your research, which may mean that, or historically has always meant people had to move. If they wanted to get research going, they needed to move to the States, they needed to move to Europe. That's far less so now, and rightly so, but all the same, people need to know those people are there, and they need to be able to reach out. So I think the cash bit's there. The other point is that all too often they may have had to have worked alone, which is another reason why they had to move. Because actually, if they wanted to find colleagues of a similar standing with whom to engage and work, they had to go to find them. And that's problematic. Not everybody wants to uproot themselves or their family to go and do a thing like that. And anyway, quite frankly, we should be encouraging the research base in every country in the world if we can. The future of humanity has always depended on the quality of education and actually being able to drive forward human knowledge and understanding. And that shouldn't be limited to a few cities around the world, frankly.
And of course, the quality of health and healthcare, right?
Well, yes, indeed.
Now, when you look at whether it's changes around climate change or related to climate change, population, we're here in the United States. We've just had a vicious hurricane blow through Florida, creating almost unprecedented damage. Storms seem to be worse. Dislocation seems to be greater. What is the particular challenge of that from your perspective? You're looking at a very broad brush at the whole world, but with that kind of and that happens in the United States, the government will appropriate billions of dollars to effectively try to fix it or to rebuild. That's not possible in many countries in the world. But what do you see being the stresses on the healthcare system globally based on a more perilous environment and environment broadly speaking?
Gosh, that's a big question, Michael. Well, I'd say first that in some parts of the world, contagious disease is still a very big issue, which it's not in the developed world, as it were. One of the great successes.
Other than COVID,
well,
right?
Yes, quite so. An excellent point.
I don't know if you heard of it, but
exactly.
I got it. I've had 5 shots, Dr. Clarke. 5 shots.
I've just had my 4th.
I'm in the developed world.
Yeah, okay.
Fortunately.
Point well made, I think. It's
Yeah.
yeah. So I mean, I think, but
Or as we say in the U.S., how soon they
yeah,
forget.
no, quite so. Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is that is an extra burden for a lot of people around the world. If you leave that aside, though, yes, you're absolutely right. And the other big issue would be things that are known to be bad for health, like poor environment, bad housing, all poor diet, all those sorts of things. They carry those burdens at the same time. So if you have an incident of the sort you're talking about, bad flooding, earthquake, fires, or whatever, that adds to the whole thing, and they are reliant largely then on the charitable world. So either big government donations, which are certainly significant, and then the action of charities of one sort or another globally who come in and help. But actually, more and more, what you need is local resilience. And that's partly building up local healthcare services so that they can deliver. But it's still a serious problem. I mean, if you think of the percentage of GDP that a first world country has to spend on healthcare to maintain its citizens' health, and you think of the amount of money that's actually involved in that for a relatively small number of people in comparison, you can see the size of the challenge in relation to that. So it seems, I mean, I think leaving disasters to one side, because I think that will always be one of those everybody around the world needing to pass the bucket round, as we would say, and either provide assistance or provide cash or both. When it comes to health, much of it needs to be about preventing bad health, and that's about really building on the development of decent housing, decent food, the strength of economies as much as anything else. But in behind that, what you can't do is then destroy the environment behind it. I mean, I'm afraid I'm a strong believer that it is not possible to put the green agenda to one side. We actually have to have sustainability applying all the way through. And it is a big issue. I mean, the pharmaceutical industry is one of the least sustainable industries there is. But actually, I do know that people are beginning to tackle the issues and how much energy it actually takes to produce drugs, how much wastage there is, which is absolutely huge everywhere.
And we should point out that that UNIPLAT is tightly tied to the United Nations SDG
Yeah,
goals and is
quite
very
right.
much about sustainability. So that's an important distinction. I wonder if I could ask you to put your healthcare healthcare investor hat back on for a second, Dr. Clarke. In particular, given your level of scientific knowledge and understanding, what does it take to get your attention? I'm sure you get pitched to death. I'm sure you get decked to death. What makes you sit up and listen and look and want to know more?
Um, so, first, interesting science. So, is this looking at something where current treatments are inadequate or less than perfect? Is it a significant development? I'm not. I mean, I don't do drug development because I think that's one of those things that requires huge resources and is a kind of different space. But in devices, for example, which is a bit of a Cinderella area for a lot of venture capitalists, particularly in Europe, is it going to make a difference? Is it easy to use? I'm definitely interested. Is it the kind of thing that will make a difference in global markets and not just in Europe or the US or China or Japan? How far will this go? But not so worried about what the team is, except how good is the science and scientists and has it been confirmed and all that sort of thing. But we're definitely diagnostics is now of particular interest to me. because I think that's one of the things. I mean, we are moving very fast to understanding things better than we used to. I mean, it's simply astonishing, going back to what you were saying, how much we've learned about COVID in a very short period of time because we had to.
That was kind of miraculous. Wasn't that miraculous scientifically when you think
Yeah.
of, I know there was a movie by the director Steven Soderbergh called Contagion, in which they were very meticulous about making it accurate. And the one thing they did that they thought was inaccurate was in the movie, the development of the vaccine happened almost overnight. And they were like kind of embarrassed about that because that could never happen. And of course, that's exactly what did happen. The vaccine came to be just miraculous. And I mean, we've already forgotten how amazing that was.
Well, that's absolutely true. Yeah. I mean, I think it's what we shall see, but I mean, it's you never know when someone presents you with an idea whether it's going to be in that category or not. And the real question at the beginning is trying to find out, is it too good to be true? How good is the science? And this is where UNIPLAT kind of comes in here, because one of the things you'd always look at is there any published science around this? Have the people who are coming to see you actually done the research and then got it peer reviewed and published? But for some people in some parts of the world, that's not so straightforward. And if that's part of the validation process, then immediately they're going to find it more difficult to raise money. But from an investor's point of view, how do you then go and make sure that what you're looking at stacks up and that it isn't kind of, you're not going to get somebody turning around and saying, well, hang on. I was put in mind of that by some very interesting research we saw at one point when we were looking at, it had its origins in research looking at safety of mobile telephones, cell phones. And it clearly had the work that was done was using electromagnetic fields to change certain bodily reactions and then act on them at the time. And the standard cardiologist response was, this can't be happening because there is insufficient energy in these electromagnetic fields to have the effects that are described. And the inventor said to me, that's just the wrong analysis. This is not about power, this is about signaling. So it's the difference between your turning off your television set at the mains and using your channel changer with a 1.5 volt battery to change the behavior of the television. And that is the kind of thing where you need external validation because you've got an argument between two professionals. And as an outside investor, without the expertise, you need to be able to understand whether it makes sense what you're being told or whether there's some other. You've got to be good at asking questions, but you've also got to know who you're asking the questions of. And I think that's why UNIPLAT, to me, it's really attractive in that respect, that you can bring together people where you can have a forum and you can get those questions put on the table and actually get an idea of what you're talking about. And you can introduce people who've come up with ideas from anywhere, but who need professional validation to go with them in order to attract money. And that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's a powerful concept. And I think you're a great spokesperson for UNIPLAT for all of these reasons. What do you see in the few moments we have left? I'm curious if you had to predict some breakthroughs or significant new wrinkles in the healthcare space, which from my perspective is very crowded. It's very hard to differentiate, as I think you're pointing out. Sometimes you don't have the data. Almost nobody has your level of expertise, obviously. But what do you get excited about when you think about the future of healthcare? Are you seeing things that you think will have a profound impact in the coming years?
Yes, I think if you just took diabetes, which I think is about, one, it's a big first world problem, but it's actually becoming a problem everywhere else. There are some huge steps forward in terms of helping people. The diagnostics around diabetes are going to be such that it will be relatively straightforward for people to just keep a constant eye on the key measures around them, and make sure that they're eating and taking exercise and so forth in a way that stops them ever becoming diabetic. And I think that it's the cause of a huge amount of first world illness, but it's increasingly becoming a global problem. And that, to me, is an illustration of, I mean, it's not quite Apple Watch territory, because I'm too old to wear an Apple Watch and it'd be hopeless. I mean, running is just not on the cards.
I haven't worn a watch in about 25 years, but the result is I actually know what time it is.
Yeah, quite so.
I did a class. This is a total aside, but I did a workshop on storytelling for startups, and I finished my bit or whatever, and I said, any questions? Nobody had any questions, and I looked at the watch and I said, an hour on the button.
Quite right.
That comes from being in radio, actually. That's my excuse. Yeah. But forgive the segue.
Quite right.
But diabetes is, I happen to have it. It's very close to my heart. I've been pre-diabetic. I've been diabetic. I've controlled it with diet to a degree, but it's a pretty scary thing. I woke up about a month ago and I couldn't move these fingers.
Really?
And I was like, what the heck? And I'm pretty sure it was diabetic neuropathy. And I immediately Googled it, thinking like, not knowing what to think. And it said, well, this is a permanent condition. And I was like, I panicked, but I've got to tell you, it went away, but I was really scared straight by that. No more anything that isn't, no more sugar, no more nothing, but it kind of took that revelation for me. And I'm obviously in a first world situation where I'm seeing doctors, I'm being diagnosed. And it's going to be, I mean, how many people have diabetes or are pre-diabetic? It's got to be, I mean, easily hundreds of millions, maybe a billion.
It's a very big number. That's certainly right.
Yeah. Yeah. So is it also a developing world problem? You say it's more so. Is that because
of dietary change? It really is more sugar in diets. And more carbohydrates. Okay. So a lot of kind of work that way, but it's illustrative, though, of the notion of actually giving people more control over the information they need to just get on and live their lives in a relatively healthy fashion. We can decry watches and so forth, but to be fair, for younger people, that's going to be part of their lives. It's what they do. But I'm not saying it's the only thing. There are other ways of doing it. But for large amounts of the world, the issue is actually feeding properly in the first place. So I think there's kind of, I've been involved in charities in Africa, which are all about actually doing things like improving seed banks for farmers and things like that. So actually, you right from the word go, you're basically saying let's get quality into food and so forth. There was one thing before we finished that I did want to mention: the recent development on UNIPLAT, which I think is the most important thing I can think of at the moment, which is the introduction of CEOs to startup guys. People who are starting businesses are more often than not they're inventors, they're scientists. I mean, people who are doing stuff, but what they've never done is run a business, and they don't know how to, and they can't afford to employ high quality CEOs been around for a long time. There is a UNIPLAT development which I think is just beginning, which is designed to try and introduce people who've got a track record as CEOs who are really interested in helping people in startups to actually get it right. And that seems to me, as an investor, I think that it's absolutely critical, and is a really good thing to be doing. So if there are any CEOs out there listening to this, get involved with UNIPLAT, because you couldn't do a better thing than to get stuck in.
Go to uniplat.social, get set up as a facilitator at the very least, but let us know and we'll point you in the right direction for sure. Well, Dr. Nigel Clarke, it's a pleasure. It's an education. I'm really grateful for your time today. So thank you.
Not at all, Michael. Much enjoyed talking to you.
Always a pleasure. This is the Accelerator with Michael Conniff. We're a podcast that you can find on all the major podcast platforms: Audible, Apple, Amazon, Spotify, and so on. Also on YouTube. Thanks for being with us today, and keep tuned for our next podcast. We'll be back before you know.